Why did 13 out of the 32 British colonies in North America decide to rebel? Part of the answer can be found by looking at the distinctive social, economic, and political structures of the 13, and in the growing appearance of a new American culture. In 1700, the population of the 13 colonies was less than 300,000. By 1775, the population grew to 2.5 million people. Colonists doubled their population every 25 years. Much of the increase was due to a boom in the birth rate. In 1700, there were 20 Englishmen to one colonist. In 1775, the difference was only 3 to 1. This had political consequences as the balance of power shifted between the colonies and Britain. Colonial America was a melting pot of ethnicities from the beginning. There were German, Dutch, African, Scots-Irish, Scots, Swedish, and Welsh, each bringing their unique contributions to the culture and character of the American colonies. Colonial America was a melting pot from the beginning, although basically English. Germans composed 6% of the population. They fled religious persecution, economic depression, and war. They settled primarily in Pennsylvania and were mostly Lutheran. Scots-Irish, who were actually lowland Scots that had been transplanted to Ireland where they did poorly, came to America. They were Protestant Presbyterians who were not exactly welcomed by the Roman Catholic Irish. Once in America, they chiefly settled in Pennsylvania. The best land had already been taken by the Quakers and the Germans, so they pressed westward and settled the American frontier. About 5% of the colonial population consisted of many other European groups, like the French Huguenots, Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish, Swiss, and Scots Highlanders, all of which felt no loyalty to the English monarchy. The largest non-English group was African, composing nearly 1/5 of the colonial population in 1775. The South had held 90% of the African slave population. In the deepest South, slave life was severe. The climate was hostile to health, the labor was life-draining. The rice and indigo plantations were a lonely life. Blacks in the tobacco-growing Chesapeake region had a somewhat easier lot. Tobacco plantations were larger and closer to one another than the rice plantations. The size and proximity of plantations in the Chesapeake region permitted slaves more visits with friends and relatives. As the population of female slaves rose by 1720, family life was possible. Slaves also contributed to the labor pool as skilled artisans, carpenters, bricklayers, and tanners. The New York slave revolt in 1712 cost the lives of 9 whites, which caused the execution of 21 blacks. Some burned alive over a slow fire. The South Carolina slave revolt in 1739 occurred when some slaves marched along the Stono River to Spanish Florida. they never made it. Above, Africans destined for slavery. This engraving from 1830 is an example of anti-slavery propaganda in the pre-Civil War era. It shows hapless Africans being brought ashore in America under the whips of slave traders and, ironically, under the figurative shadow of the national capital. To the right, we see advertisements for slave sales in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1753, Charleston had the largest slave market in the colonies. Yarrow Mammoet by Charles Wilson Peale, 1819. When Peale painted this portrait, Mammoet was over 100 years old. A devout Muslim brought to Maryland as a slave, he eventually bought his freedom and settled in Georgetown. The emergence of an African American culture. In this scene from the mid-19th century, African Americans play musical instruments of European derivation, like the fiddle, as well as instruments of African origin, like the bones and the banjo, a vivid illustration of the blending of the two cultures in the crucible of the New World. America seemed a shining land of equality and opportunity, except for slavery. But on the eve of revolution, America was showing signs of stratification and barriers to mobility. Wars enriched merchant princes in New England and the middle colonies. War created a class of widows and orphans. In New England, with open land less available, descendants faced limited prospects, and farms got smaller. Younger children were hired out as wage laborers. Boston's homeless poor increased. In the South, large plantations continued their disproportionate ownership of slaves. The largest slave owners increased their wealth. Poor whites increasingly became tenant farmers. Lower classes further swelled by the stream of indentured servants. Many ultimately achieved prosperity, however. 2 signed the Declaration of Independence. Less fortunate were 50,000 paupers and convicts, known as jailbirds, who were involuntarily shipped to America. Least fortunate of all were the black slaves. They enjoyed no equality with whites. They were oppressed and downtrodden. Some white colonists worried about the growing number of slaves in the colonies. British authorities, however, resisted any attempt to limit the transatlantic slave trade. Colonial professions. Most honored was the Christian ministry, but by 1775, ministers had less influence than earlier. Most physicians were poorly trained. The first medical school was established in 1765. Aspiring young doctors served as apprentices. At first, lawyers were not favorably regarded. Agriculture was the leading occupation, employing 90% of people. Tobacco was the main crop of Maryland and Virginia. The middle or bread colonies produced much grain. Overall, Americans enjoyed a higher standard of living than the masses of any country. Fishing ranked far below agriculture, yet was rewarding with a bustling commerce. Commercial ventures were another path to wealth. The colonial economy. By the 18th century, the various colonial regions had distinct economic identities. The northern colonies grew grain and raised cattle, harvested timber and fish, and built ships. The Chesapeake colonies in North Carolina were still heavily dependent on tobacco, whereas the southernmost colonies grew mostly rice and indigo. Cotton, so important to the southern economy in the 19th century, had not yet emerged as a major crop. Triangular trade was very profitable. Manufacturing was of secondary importance. Household manufacturing, that's spinning and weaving by women, added impressive output. Skilled craftspeople were few and highly prized. Lumbering was the most important manufacturing activity. Colonial naval stores were also highly valued. This is a map of colonial trade patterns about 1770. Future President John Adams noted about this time that the commerce of the West Indies is a part of the American system of commerce. They can neither do without us, nor we without them. The Creator has placed us upon the globe in such a situation that we have occasion for each other. But an imbalance of trade developed in the 1730s. In 1733, British passed the Molasses Act to squelch North American trade with the French West Indies. Americans responded with smuggling. This foreshadowed the impending imperial crisis. Headstrong Americans would rather revolt than submit to the dictates of a far-off parliament that seemed bent on destroying their livelihood. America, with a scarcity of money and workers, suffered oppressive transportation problems. Roads did not connect to major cities until the 1700s. Roads were often clouds of dust in summer and quagmires of mud in the winter. Dangers included tree-strewn roads, rickety bridges, carriage overturns, and runaway horses. Population clustered along the banks of navigable rivers, and taverns sprang up along the main routes. Gossips also gathered at taverns. Taverns helped crystallize public opinion and proved to be hotbeds of agitation as the revolutionary movement gathered momentum. In the mid-1700s, the intercolonial postage system started. (1775). Anglican and Congregational were the tax-supported, established churches. Most people did not worship in any church. In colonies that had established churches, but only a minority belonged in the Church of England. Members were called Anglicans. It was the official faith in Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and part of New York. The Church of England. In England, it was a major prop of kingly authority. In America, the Anglican Church fell short of its promise. It was less fierce and more worldly than the religion of the puritanical New England. Sermons were shorter. In 1693, the College of William and Mary in Virginia was established to train a better class of clergy. The Congregational Church. It grew out of the Puritan Church. It was formally established in New England, except Rhode Island, and at first it was supported by taxing all residents. Congregational and Presbyterian ministers grappled with political questions. Anglican ministers hesitated to resist the crown. For the time, religious toleration existed in the colonies. Spiritual conditions of the colonies. In all colonial churches, religion was less fervid in early 18th century than before. The Puritan churches, in particular, sagged under the weight of two burdens: their elaborate theological doctrines and their compromising efforts to liberalize membership requirements. Clerical intellectualism sapped the spiritual vitality from many denominations. Arminianism, named after Jacobus Arminius, challenged the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. He claimed that all humans, not just the elect, could be saved if they accepted God's grace. This doctrine was considered a heresy. Between the 1730s and 1740s, the Great Awakening exploded. It was started by Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts. His sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," warned that relying on good works was a folly. He said Christians must depend solely on God's grace, and he provided lurid detail on hell. George Whitefield's evangelical preaching revolutionized spiritual life in the colonies. Orthodox clergymen, or Old Lights, were skeptical of the emotionalism and theatrical antics used by revivalists. New Lights defended the awakening for revitalizing American religion. Congregationalists and Presbyterians split over this issue, and many joined the Baptists or Methodists. The awakening left many lasting effects. The emphasis on direct, emotive spirituality seriously undermined the old clergy. Many schisms increased the number and competitiveness of American churches. It encouraged new waves of missionary work. It led to the founding of colleges. It was the first spontaneous mass movement, and it contributed to a growing sense of Americanism. Education was first reserved for the aristocratic few. Education should be for leadership, not citizenship, and primarily for males. Puritans were more zealous in education. The primary goal of the clergy was to make good Christians rather than good citizens. A more secular approach was evident by the 1800s. Educational trends. Education for boys flourished. New England established schools, but the quality and length of instruction varied widely. The South, because of geography, was severely hampered in establishing effective school systems. Wealthy Southern families leaned heavily on private tutors. The general atmosphere in colonial schools and colleges was grim and gloomy. They emphasized religion and classical languages, Latin and Greek. They focused on doctrine and dogma, not reason and experiment. Discipline was severe. College education was geared toward preparing men for the ministry. Above, the College of New Jersey at Princeton, 1764, later known as Princeton University. It was chartered in 1746 by the Presbyterian Synod, though open to students of all religious persuasions. The fourth college to be founded in British North America, it met in Elizabeth and Newark, New Jersey, until a gift of 10 acres of land precipitated a move to Princeton in 1756. All classes were held in the large building, Nassau Hall. Here, the Continental Congress met for 3 months during the summer of 1783, making Princeton for a short time the capital of the nation. This copper engraving, based on a drawing by one of Princeton's earliest students, was part of a series of college views that reflected colonial Americans' growing pride in institutions of higher learning. Nine colleges were established during the colonial era. Student enrollments were small, about 200. Instruction was poor, with curriculum heavily loaded with theology and dead languages. By 1750, there was a distinct trend toward live languages and modern subjects. Ben Franklin helped launch the University of Pennsylvania, the first college free from any church. Art and culture still had European tastes, especially British. Colonial contributions. John Trumbull, 1756 to 1843, was a painter. Charles Willson Peale, 1741 to 1827, was known for his portrait of George Washington, ran a museum. Benjamin West, 1738 to 1820, and John Singleton Copley, 1738 to 1815, were famous painters. Colonial craftsmanship in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, parents gave daughters painted wooden chests to hold their precious dowry linens at marriage. The horsemen, unicorns, and flower patterns on this dower chest confirm its origin in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Other colonial contributions. Architecture was largely imported and modified to meet peculiar conditions of the New World. The log cabin was borrowed from Sweden. 1720, red-bricked Georgian style introduced. Noteworthy literature was the poetry of enslaved Phyllis Wheatley, 1753 to 1784. Benjamin Franklin wrote Poor Richard's Almanac. Science was slowly making progress. A few botanists, mathematicians, and astronomers won repute. Benjamin Franklin was considered the only first-rank scientist produced in the American colonies. Magnetic dispensary, circa 1790. This British painting made sport of the era's faddish preoccupations with electricity. Following Franklin's experiments, static electricity generated here by the machine on the right was employed for medicinal purposes, as well as for tingling entertainments. Americans were generally too poor to buy books and too busy to read. The Byrd family of Virginia had the largest collection, about 4,000 volumes. Benjamin Franklin established in Philadelphia the first privately supported circulating library. By 1776, there were about 50 public libraries and collections supported by subscription. Printing presses. They first printed pamphlets, leaflets, and journals. 40 newspapers existed on the eve of the Revolution. Newspapers were a powerful agency for airing colonial grievances and rallying opposition. The Zenger Trial, 1734 to 1735. John Peter Zenger assailed the corrupt royal governor. The Zenger decision helped establish the doctrine that true statements about public officials could not be prosecuted as libel. It was a banner achievement for freedom of the press and for the health of democracy. It pointed the way for the open discussion required by the diverse society. There were three kinds of colonial governors. By 1775, 8 colonies had royal governors appointed by the king. 3 had governors selected by proprietors: Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Connecticut and Rhode Island elected their own governors under self-governing charters. Each colony had a 2-house legislature. The upper house was appointed by the crown in 8 royal colonies and by the proprietor in 3 proprietary colonies. It was chosen by voters in 2 self-governing colonies. The lower house was the popular branch, elected by the people, that is, property owners. In some colonies, the backcountry areas were seriously underrepresented and resented the colonial elite. Above we see a picture called The Hunting Party. New Jersey fox hunting began as a necessity in the colonies, where farmers on foot tried to keep foxes from overrunning the countryside. By the 18th century, it had become an organized sport among the well-to-do mounted on horseback. George Washington was famed as an ardent fox hunter, breeding his own hounds and importing a fine hunting wardrobe from England. Huntsmen wore scarlet coats to be easily visible even in the depths of the forest, and cork-lined black hats for protection from low-hanging branches or a fall. Self-taxation through representation was a privilege Americans cherished above most others. London generally left colonial governors to the mercies of the legislatures. Colonial assemblies asserted authority over governors by withholding their salary. Administration at the local level varied. County governments remained the rule in the South. Town meetings predominated in New England. The middle colonies used a mixture of the 2 forms. Town meetings with open discussion and open voting were a cradle of self-government. The ballot was by no means a birthright. Upper classes, fearful of democratic excesses, were unwilling to grant the ballot to everyone. In 1775, the ballot still had religious and property qualifications. About half of adult white males were disfranchised. But right to vote was not impossible to obtain because it was easy to acquire land. Yet, eligible voters often did not exercise this privilege. Instead, they deferred to the elite. By 1775, America was not a true democracy socially, economically, or politically. But colonies were far more democratic than Europe. Democratic seeds were planted, later bringing forth a lush harvest. The popular game of billiards. Most likely brought over by the Dutch and English settlers, billiards provided amusement in local taverns throughout the colonies. By the 19th century, Americans, like the British and French, who had long dominated the sport, had become obsessed with these games of cues and balls. The most popular form of pool, 8-ball, was not invented until 1900. Everyday life was drab and tedious. Food was plentiful, but the diet was coarse and monotonous. Basic comforts were lacking. Amusement was eagerly pursued where time and custom permitted. By 1775, British North America looked like a patchwork quilt. Each colony was slightly different, but all were stitched together by common origins, common ways of life, and common beliefs in toleration, economic development, and self-rule. All were physically separated from the seat of imperial authority. These facts set the stage for the struggle to unite. France was a latecomer in the scramble for New World real estate. It was convulsed by foreign wars and domestic strife during the 1500s. It was involved in clashes between Roman Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. On St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, over 10,000 Huguenots, men, women, and children, were butchered in cold blood. 1598, the era of the Edict of Nantes. Issued by the Crown, it granted limited toleration to French Protestants. France blossomed, led by brilliant ministers and by King Louis XIV, who reigned for 72 years, from 1643 to 1715. Faithfully for North America, he took a deep interest in overseas colonies. In 1698, the permanent beginnings of a French empire were established at Quebec. Efforts were led by Samuel de Champlain, father of New France. He established friendly relationships with Huron Indian tribes. He entered into a treaty with the Huron against the Iroquois tribes of the Upper New York area. Government of New France, Canada, finally fell under direct control of the king. This regime was almost completely autocratic. The people elected no representative assemblies. They did not enjoy the right to trial by jury as in the English colonies. The population of Catholic New France grew slowly. In the late 1750s, only 60,000 or so whites were in New France. Land-owning French peasants had little motive to move. French Huguenots were denied a refuge. The French government favored its Caribbean islands. New France contained one valuable resource: the beaver. European fashion setters valued beaver pelt hats and colorful coureurs de bois trapped beavers. They littered the land with scores of place names: Baton Rouge, Red Stick; Terre Haute, High Land; and Des Moines, some monks. French voyagers recruited Indians into the fur business. The Indian fur flotilla that arrived in Montreal in 1693 numbered 400 canoes. Many of these Indians were decimated by the white man's diseases and alcohol. Mass slaughter of beavers violated many Indians' religious beliefs and caused great ecological damage. Quebec Scene by Jean-Baptiste Louis Franquelin, circa 1699. The metal cooking pot and the Indians' clothing and blankets show the Native Americans' growing reliance on European trade goods. Fur trading posts. To serve the needs of European fashion, fur traders pursued the beaver for more than 2 centuries over the entire continent of North America. They brought many Indians for the first time into contact with white culture. Catholic missionaries, Jesuits, tried to save Indians for Christ and from fur trappers. Some suffered torture by the Indians. They had few converts who did not play a vital role as explorers and geographers. Other explorers sought neither souls nor fur, but empire to block Spanish and English expansion. French explorers. Antoine Cadillac founded Detroit, the city of straits. Robert de La Salle floated down the Mississippi in 1682 to where it mingles with the Gulf. He named the interior basin Louisiana after Louis XIV. He failed to find the Mississippi Delta, landed in Spanish Texas, and in 1687 was murdered. The French planted several fortified posts in what is now Mississippi and Louisiana. New Orleans was founded in 1718. The forts in fertile Illinois country, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, became the grain garden of France's North America empire. The earliest contests among European powers for control of North America. In King William's War, 1689 to 1697, and Queen Anne's War, 1702 through 1713, British colonists fought French coureurs de bois. Indian allies ravaged Schenectady, New York, and Deerfield, Massachusetts. The arrows indicate French Indian attacks. Schenectady was burned to the ground in the raid of 1690. At Deerfield, site of the New England frontier's bloodiest confrontations, invaders killed 50 inhabitants and sent more than 100 others fleeing for their lives into the winter wilderness. The Indian attackers also took over 100 Deerfield residents captive, including the child Titus King. He later wrote, "Captivity is an awful school for children, when we see how quick they will fall in with the Indian ways. Nothing seems to be more taking. In 6 months' time, they forsake father and mother, forget their own land, refuse to speak their own tongue, and seemingly be wholly swallowed up with the Indians." Peace terms signed at Utrecht in 1713 revealed how badly France and its Spanish ally had been beaten. Britain gained French-populated Arcadia, which the British renamed Nova Scotia, as well as Newfoundland and Hudson Bay. Losses pinched France's settlements on the St. Lawrence and thereby sealed their ultimate doom. In the picture above, we see Chief of the Tansa Indians receiving La Salle, March 20, 1682, by George Catlin, 1847 through 1848. Driven by the dream of a vast North American empire for France, La Salle spent years exploring the Great Lakes region and the valleys of the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. This scene of his encounter with an Indian chieftain was imaginatively recreated by the 19th century artist George Catlin. American colonies then experienced decades of salutary neglect. which was fertile soil for the roots of independence. British also won limited trading rights in Spanish America, which of course led to smuggling. British Captain Robert Jenkins had one ear sliced off by a Spanish official, which led to the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739. The War of Jenkins' Ear merged with the larger War of Austrian Succession in Europe, called King George's War in America. New Englanders, with help from the British Navy, captured Louisbourg, which commanded the St. Lawrence River, but was returned to France by the Treaty of 1749. France still clung to its vast holdings. The Ohio Valley became the chief bone of contention between the French and the British. For the British, it was a critical area for westward movement. The French needed it to link their Canadian holdings to those of the lower Mississippi Valley. The British colonists were determined to fight for their economic security and supremacy. The Ohio Valley rivalry increased tensions. The French erected a chain of forts along the Ohio River. Fort Duquesne was at the pivotal point where the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers join to form the Ohio River, the later site of Pittsburgh. In 1754, the governor of Virginia sent young George Washington to the Ohio country to secure the Virginians' claim. In this skirmish, Washington met some French troops about 40 miles from Fort Duquesne and fired. The French leader was killed and his men retreated. The French returned and surrounded Washington. Washington, after a 10-hour siege, surrendered, but was allowed to march troops away with honor. In response, the British brutally uprooted French Acadians and scattered them as far as Louisiana. Descendants are known as Cajuns. The first of three Anglo-French colonial wars started in Europe, but the fourth one started in America. The French and Indian War, started by Washington in the Ohio Valley in 1754, widened after 2 years into the 7 Years' War in America, Europe, the West Indies, Africa, the Philippines, and on the ocean. The 7 Years' War was a 7-sea war. The crisis demanded concerted action. In 1754, the British government summoned an intercolonial Congress to meet at Albany, New York. Only 7 colonies sent delegates. The immediate purpose was to control the Iroquois tribes loyal to Britain. The longer-range goal was to increase colonial unity and thus bolster common defense against France. Benjamin Franklin was the leading spirit at the Albany Congress. He published the famous cartoon, Join or Die. He presented a well-devised but premature scheme for colonial home rule. Albany delegates unanimously adopted it. Individual colonies rejected it, as did the British government. To colonists, it did not give enough independence. To the British, it gave too much. Franklin observed that everyone agreed on need for union, but were distracted when they tried to agree on the details. Opening clashes of war went badly for the British. General Edward Braddock was sent to Virginia with a strong detachment of British regulars. He set out in 1755 with 2,000 men to capture Fort Duquesne. On his way, he met a smaller French and Indian army. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullets pierced his coat. Braddock was fatally wounded. The British were routed and suffered large losses. Inflamed by easy victory, Indians launched assaults from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. Washington, with 300 men, tried to defend the frontier. The British experienced defeat after defeat. William Pitt was Britain's superlative leader. He was known as the Great Commoner. In 1857, he became a key leader in the London government. He downplayed assaults on the French West Indies. He concentrated on the vital Quebec-Montreal area of Canada. He picked young and energetic military leaders. In 1758, he dispatched an expedition that took Louisbourg, the first major British victory. He sent James Wolfe to take Quebec. Wolfe battled the Marquis de Montcalm's forces on the Plains of Abraham outside of Quebec. Both commanders were fatally wounded. The French were defeated and Quebec surrendered. The Battle of Quebec in 1759 was one of the most significant battles in British and American history. When Montreal fell in 1760, the French flag fluttered for the last time in Canada. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 displaced the French Empire from the North American continent. The French were able to maintain several small but valuable sugar islands in the West Indies. France also received 2 never-to-be-fortified islets in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for fishing stations. The final blow: France ceded to Spain all of trans-Mississippi Louisiana, including New Orleans. Great Britain emerged as the dominant power in North America and the leading world naval power. View of the taking of Quebec. On the night of September 13, 1759, British forces scaled the rocky cliffs of Quebec and defeated the French army defending the city. The following year, Montreal, France's last bastion in North America, surrendered. Fighting continued in the Caribbean, Europe, and the Philippines for 2 more years until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, eliminating France as a colonial power in North America. North America before 1754 and after 1763, after French losses. Britain's colonists emerged with increased confidence in their military strength and skill. 20,000 colonists were still under arms at war's end. War shattered the myth of British invincibility. Displaying the contempt of professional soldiers, the British refused to recognize any American militia commission above the rank of captain. British officials were distressed by the reluctance of some colonies to support the war wholeheartedly. Some colonies, self-centered and alienated by their distance from war, refused to provide troops and money for the conflict. Colonies still exhibited strong tendencies toward disunity. But unity among colonies received some encouragement during the war. When soldiers and statesmen from different colonies met, they discovered they were all Americans who spoke the same language and shared common ideals. a coherent nation could emerge, but it would not be easy. Removal of the French menace in Canada profoundly affected American attitudes. In a sense, history of the United States began with the fall of Quebec and Montreal. Spanish and Indian threats were substantially reduced. Spanish removal from Florida and French removal from Canada deprived Indians of potential allies to offset growing British power. Pontiac's uprising by Ottawa Chief Pontiac laid siege to Detroit in 1763 and overran all but 3 British posts west of the Appalachians. Some 2,000 soldiers and settlers were killed. The British retaliated swiftly and cruelly with a primitive version of biological warfare. Pontiac died in 1769 at the hands of a rival chieftain. Colonists were now free to cross the Appalachian Mountains and take western lands. But London issued the Proclamation of 1763, which banned settlement beyond the Appalachians. Britain only wanted to avoid another bloody Indian uprising, but angry colonists flouted the proclamation. The stage was set for conflict. The colonists refused to be restrained, and British government was frustrated with the colonies. British colonies at the end of the 7 Years' War. In 1763, this map shows the colonies 13 years before the Declaration of Independence and helps to explain why the British were unable to conquer their offspring. The colonists were spreading rapidly into the backcountry where the powerful British Navy could not flush them out. During the Revolutionary War, the British at one time or another captured the leading colonial cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. But the more remote interior remained a sanctuary for the rebels.